Okay, the battle is now over, and it's time for some reflection on what went right, what went wrong, what could have happened differently. Now, I'll start with the French and their initial plans. You may recall that the French initially wanted to focus on Hougoumont and drive Rey's entire corps at Hougoumont, with Bataille on the right, Foy in the centre, and Jerome on the left. Now, very early on, I realised how very tough this walled complex would be to break, and I started to focus more efforts on the flanks. Bringing that heavy and light cavalry around here was very effective. It just stopped the Allies from bringing up their forces. The Royal Horse Artillery lost the race to those heights. They did unlimber, but they could never get clear lines of fire. The Dutch Belgians were placed in front of them. Mismanagement of those separate forces meant that the Royal Horse Artillery never got effective firing targets against the French, which enabled the French cavalry out here to pick and choose their targets and seize the initiative and hold that initiative out here on that left flank for several hours. With Jerome in close support, they slowly cleared, you can see that artillery is still there, slowly cleared the British from around that left flank, and eventually, with again cavalry support, they managed to push up onto that clear ground. At the same time, Bataille had much success. Lebeau supported him on the right. Lebeau's 6th Corps supported on the right, and together they managed to squeeze the British very slowly out of the orchards. This was not the quick seizure of Hougoumont as I had originally hoped and planned as the French. It was a slow, steady grind, but nonetheless successful. In fact, by the time that walled complex of buildings finally fell, there were no other Allied units in this area. I think both Bataille and Jerome had moved up to this high ground. It was just Foy left to fire away at those defenders in the buildings, and the buildings themselves were no longer slowing up or holding up the French. It was no longer the threat that it once was. And you may recall Lebeau's 6th Corps had tried to move up into this open ground to support on their left or right. They suffered very heavily from an Allied heavy cavalry charge, a series of heavy cavalry charges in the centre, which very quickly brought Lebeau's 6th Corps up to morale level 3 and made it difficult for them to play any significant role in the battle from there on. D'Erlon was slow to start, but he gradually moved up his forces in this area here. This is difficult terrain to navigate, a lot of steep slopes, difficult for the artillery and the cavalry to move through, but eventually they got going, and they, through, I think, weight of numbers and superior morale, pushed the Dutch Belgians and the Hanoverians, Nassauers, off those ridges. It certainly captured much of that high ground, but it wasn't until they got the cavalry involved, the heavy cavalry up here on the right of the 13th and 14th, and the Guard light cavalry in particular were very effective at threatening and disrupting the Allied forces out here east of the highway. Credit to the British 5th and 6th Brigade of the Reserve Corps in the centre, some of them still holding their ground after, an entire day of fighting. You can see those men in square there. They have suffered very few casualties, I think a couple of increments lost, but they've only started to suffer very recently, and they have held off the French in this area of D'Erlon's Corps, left side of D'Erlon's Corps. The French captured La Haye-Sainte, but they couldn't really press much further to the north because of those British defenders. So all told, the French plan out here on the left went pretty well. They, modified their assault on Hougoumont to focus on the flanks, leaving the buildings largely alone without wasting too much of their effort, pushing the British back, forcing Wellington to continually shift between the left and the right, and not being able to coordinate his forces very effectively. Now you may recall earlier the guard. We dedicated the guard to holding in reserve and then dealing with the Prussians when they began to arrive. And the guard, instead of holding back, really pushed into an aggressive defensive position through these woods here, just southwest of the Bois de Paris. There are some good heights here. The woods, they occupied a few of those urban areas and held their ground very strongly throughout several hours of fighting. All they had to do here was just hold and defend. They launched a few counter assaults here and there, but they never really had any long-term plans to advance against the Prussians. They were just holding this area whilst Reille, Lebeau, Mouton and Erlon and the cavalry did all the work out here against the Allied army in the centre. And ultimately it's a plan that succeeded. Many times I thought the Guard would not be able to hold out against these Prussians. And many times I was proven wrong. Alright, let's flip it around and see things from the Allied perspective. Perhaps the Allies should have sent more troops into Hougoumont. You may recall very early on, they pushed forward with the British Guards and supporting units on their flanks. I thought that was a bit too much, but maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe they should have sent more, particularly the likes of the Dutch Belgians and Hanoverians, perhaps some closer support, perhaps instead of dedicating so many forces out here on their right, just facing off against the French cavalry and artillery. They should have focused more around this area. When they began to threaten the 6th Corps, that was very successful, and for a time it looked like they may even push around. You may recall there was some light cavalry and artillery out here, Allied forces threatening the 6th Corps and Waterloo, the sort of eastern flank of Reille's men. That was good for a time, until, I guess, the French began to push out here in the east. Because, and the situation throughout the battle is because the French had the initiative, because they are choosing when and where to assault, I think that was a big advantage to them. The Allies are responding and were responding throughout the day to what the French were doing. In those brief moments when the Allies did seize the initiative and did launch those counter-assaults, they tended to do very well, like along here and a few counter-assaults along here. Perhaps they should have done more of that, more counter-attacks, counter-assaults throughout the day. They just ultimately suffered too many casualties. The British Guards in particular perhaps should not have pushed so far forward alone. There's a lot to reflect on what happened in and around this area. The Guards in particular just suffering too many casualties, too many British casualties, which pushed their morale level up to numbers they couldn't recover from. And despite their superior morale, these are elite units. Many of them were eliminated. There were a few unlucky routs of those Guards units, and it's just hard to recover from there. And I guess another key factor is French cavalry superiority and command superiority. The French can just activate their cavalry over and over again and continue to drive and push, whereas the Allies just cannot do that. They struggle for, I guess, activation, coordination, and control. Out here, just the French, again, initiative, picking and choosing their targets, shifting their focus, and the Allies unable to respond to that, just being whittled down increment by increment. And once, you may recall, when that French heavy cavalry shifted around here with the Guards' light cavalry, in combination with Reille's advance, it was too much for the Allies to be able to respond to. At the same time that this is happening, the Allied heavy cavalry was over here, and perhaps had they not pushed through there, because great, they brought the 6th Corps up to morale level 3, that was great, but at the same time they lost the ridge. So maybe the Allied heavy cavalry should have come across here to the left instead to counter that French assault, because it was ultimately devastating for the French to get into behind the Allied lines along this ridge. Now, a lot has been said about the Prussian advance and the decisions made by the Prussians. So, when the Prussians began to arrive, the Guards had already set up a good position here. You may recall they had a very strong Guards artillery battery out in this open area. They set sort of their terminuses around this area, and their plan was to drive right into the flank of Rey's corps as they were rolling up, or attempting to roll up the Allied line. So part of 4th Corps is still along here, and they set up along here. You may recall the other half was sent to drive immediately into Rey's men. And that was the main priority. And they did have some initial success. They haven't gained much, perhaps about half a kilometre of open ground around here. And they did, in parts, force that French heavy cavalry back. All of that was predicated on the idea of saving the Army of the Low Countries, keeping the French away from the flanks of the Army of the Low Countries, and ideally linking the Prussians with the Army of the Low Countries and driving the French back together. That was why the Prussians focused so much effort around this area. You can see this is very difficult terrain. They did launch a few assaults here. I'll touch on that in a moment. When Purchas's 2nd Corps arrived, they 4th Corps was largely focused in this area. They were at the time driving through here, and so 2nd Corps tried to occupy the middle ground between the two halves of 4th Corps to assist in that drive, pushing this way. They had at the time opened up a bit of a gap, and they thought they could exploit that. They had some minor success. Again, you can see they've pushed the French Guard back a little bit. They forced Rey to bring, d'Erlon to bring 2 of his divisions out here to help. But they just could not force a decisive either breakthrough or destruction of any of those Guards' divisions or of d'Erlon's divisions. So that accounts for the decision of the Prussians to focus in this area, trying at the time to save the Army of the Low Countries, to hurt d'Erlon's corps, to hurt the edges of the Guards. And that was why they focused so much effort around here. Perhaps, so what alternatives? Perhaps they should have skirted all the way around here and push through to Plassanois in the rear, which is all the way down here. Why didn't they do so? I think just immediate decisions at the time. The fact that the Guards had pushed so far up, the fact that they had this, for a start, light cavalry very active out here, a strong artillery battery here. It feels like, having watched these Prussians march all the way, by the time they finally arrived near the fighting, there was a desire to get them straight into the action and charge straight away. Even at sort of 5, 6, 7 p.m, it feels like it's getting late, and it felt like a rush for the Prussians to hit hard before the Army of the Low Countries suffered more losses. And that sort of sense of urgency is another reason why Purchas's 2nd Corps was sent in here, and 4th Corps reinforcements rushed straight in. And I dilly-dallied a lot with 1st Corps. Originally I was going to send them here. They then began to shift out, and I had planned to attack on the left flank, having destroyed that, only recently destroyed that Guard artillery. In the end, the 1st Corps was almost completely wasted, marching hither and there in the last hour or two of the battle. So perhaps poor Prussian planning, short-sightedness perhaps, a sense of being rushed, but also, I guess, the genuine belief that they could hurt. I mean, I believed at the time that the Fourth Corps and the Second Corps had sufficient numbers and strength to push the French back. I thought that's what was going to happen. I didn't count on such poor assaulting and negative morale modifiers. Failures to close, poor assault rolls, and just very incredibly stubborn guards defense. So yeah, that accounts for the Prussian decision to drive. I also, because of, as soon as I started to realise Prussian failures in assaulting, I wanted to put them in a position to follow up through a series of assaults. So assaulting. You can see here these waves of, these are currently Second Corps men, being prepared to follow in after each other. This is something I've been trying to do for several hours. Is to launch an assault, follow up with a second wave, follow up with a third wave. By the time that third wave is hitting, there may even be a fourth or a fifth wave. All these men have recovered and they're ready to go again. It's causing losses among the guards, but it has just not been significant enough to force a breakthrough. So, I guess disappointed with the poor, rolling of the Prussians, short-sightedness again, as I've said. What I thought was a good idea to hit this area of the French line turned out to be a failure. But also immensely impressed with the toughness of the guards. Their ability to, just mainly morale factors, having such a strong ability to stand and put up with whatever the Prussians throw at them. Okay, so there you have it. The French plan to assault, and at the time when the French were assaulting and up here and they're causing so much damage to the Allies, my thinking at the time was, you seize the initiative, you choose your targets for assault, and that is why the French are doing so well. When the Prussians tried to do the same thing, and I was thinking, the French have assaulted so well, surely the Prussians will be able to force these guards back. It didn't work out the same. So on the right-hand side, French assaults were splendid. On the left-hand side, Prussian assaults were the complete opposite. It certainly was a tale of sort of two halves of this battle.